Mongols had crushed empires from the steppe to the gates of Egypt. Cities burned. Caliphs fell. No one had stopped them. In September 1260, a Mamluk army waited at Ain Jalut. At its front stood a man once bought in a market and forged into a weapon. How does a boy sold in chains end up stopping the most feared army on earth? Baybars was born on the Kipchak steppe around 1227. A Mongol raid tore him from his family and sold him south until he reached Egypt. There, the Mamluks shaped him. Horse, bow, sword, and scripture. Their world was merciless. Obedience, endurance, and constant testing. He thrived in it. Chroniclers described Baybars as tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes uncommon in Egypt. He wasn't spared hardship. A damaged eye, likely from illness, made him a target for mockery early on. He answered not with words, but with skill, riding harder, striking cleaner, lasting longer than his rivals. Responsibility followed, first in small commands, then in larger ones. His name spread in the barracks, and when war came to Egypt, Baybars was ready. In 1249, Louis IX of France led the Seventh Crusade, landing with thousands. Egypt was his prize. At Mansoura, Baybars helped design the city's defense, barricaded streets, hidden cavalry, archers in windows. When the Crusaders pushed in, they were trapped in killing grounds. Horses stumbled, knights fell to arrows, and cavalry slammed them from behind. The King of France himself was captured in Mamluk chains. The victory shook the region. The old Ayyubid dynasty collapsed under its weakness, and the Mamluks, once slaves, claimed power for themselves. For Baybars, Mansoura was the proving ground. He wasn't just a skilled fighter anymore. He had shown he could plan, command, and change the fate of kingdoms. And the storms ahead would be even greater. The Mongols were unlike the Crusaders. They weren't kings chasing glory. They were a tide that drowned civilizations. In 1258, Hulagu Khan stormed Baghdad. The caliph was killed, libraries burned, and an empire that had stood for centuries was left in ashes. A year later, Mongol banners appeared in Syria. Aleppo fell. Damascus surrendered. The road to Egypt was open. Cairo braced for the end. No army had ever beaten the Mongols in open battle, but the Mamluks prepared anyway. Sultan Qutuz marched north, with Baybars at the vanguard. In September 1260, on the plain of Ain Jalut, Baybars led the opening strike. His cavalry hit fast, then feigned retreat. The Mongols surged after them, straight into an ambush. Hidden Mamluk forces closed in, arrows rained, cavalry struck the flanks. The Mongol general Kitbuka was captured and executed. For the first time, the Mongols were decisively beaten. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. Across the Islamic world, news spread like fire. The Mongols could bleed. They could be stopped. And at the heart of that moment stood Baybars. But victory raised a dangerous question. Who would rule? Sultan Qutuz had commanded the army, but it was Baybars' tactics that men whispered of. On the march back, Qutuz was murdered near Salihia. Some chroniclers accused Baybars directly. Others claimed he merely stepped aside. But what mattered was this. Within hours, the emirs turned to Baybars. He didn't hesitate. He seized the moment, claimed the throne, and took the title Al-Zahir, the Manifest. In the Mamluk world, hesitation was fatal. The slave soldier became sultan. Seizing the throne was only half the battle. To rule as sultan, Baybars needed more than fear. He needed legitimacy. In 1261, he played a masterstroke. A surviving Abbasid prince, one of the few to escape the Mongol sack of Baghdad, was invited to Cairo. Under Baybars' protection, the man was crowned caliph, and in return, the caliph formally invested Baybars as sultan. It was a political coup disguised as ceremony. By crowning a caliph to crown himself, Baybars did what no rival could. Cairo became the new seat of the caliphate, and his rule gained divine sanction the Mongols could never claim. But Baybars didn't stop at symbols. He rewired Cairo's laws. For centuries, Sunni jurists had fought for dominance. Hanafi against Shafi'i, Maliki against Hanbali. Each insisted their interpretation was supreme. Baybars cut through the chaos by appointing a chief qadi for each. The 4 judges who once competed now formed a council. It was clever statecraft. Every jurist had a seat at the table, yet none could challenge the Sultan's authority alone. He revived the barid, a courier system of riders and pigeons that carried messages in days instead of weeks. More than speed, it was surveillance. Every village knew the Sultan could hear of unrest almost instantly. With power secured at home, Baybars turned outward. Baybars was no longer just a soldier who had seized a throne. He was the architect of a new order, one where law, religion, and information all flowed through him. With Cairo secure and legitimacy in hand, Baybars turned to the Crusader states still clinging to the Levantine coast. As long as they held ports, Europe could always send reinforcements. His mission was simple: erase every foothold. From 1265 onward, he dismantled the Crusader states: Arsif, Caesarea, Safed, Jaffa, Antioch. One by one, their walls fell. Fortresses weren't just stone. They were Europe's bridgeheads. By pulling them down, Baybars erased their future. The fall of Antioch in 1268 was ruthless. Mercy had been promised, yet the city was devastated. Baybars even wrote to its absent ruler, describing the slaughter. It was more than brutality. It was psychological warfare. In 1271, Baybars faced the ultimate test: Crac de Chevalier, the strongest Crusader fortress in Syria. He combined force with deception. A forged letter appeared, supposedly from the Knights Hospitallers Grand Master, ordering the garrison to surrender. Exhausted and desperate, they believed it. The unbeatable fortress fell without a final assault, and Baybars claimed it for his own. But unlike other conquests, Baybars spared it. He repaired the walls, garrisoned it with his own men, and turned the great Crusader stronghold into a Mamluk fortress. What once guarded Christian power in Syria now stood as its tombstone. By stripping the Crusaders of their ports, allies, and fortresses, he set them on a path of slow extinction. Baybars hadn't just beaten his enemies, he had erased the future they might have had. Baybars' vision wasn't limited to the Crusader states. To secure Egypt and Syria, he had to break every ally the Crusaders might call on. In 1266, his armies struck the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia at the Battle of Mari. Longtime allies of the Crusaders and the Mongols, the Armenians believed their strength would hold. Instead, Baybars' cavalry shattered them. The disaster at Mari became legend. Thousands killed, fortresses toppled, a kingdom left crippled. For the Crusaders, it meant the loss of their northern shield. For Baybars, it proved that frontier states could be broken as easily as walls. A decade later, his reach stretched even further. In 1276, he marched south into Nubia, over deserts few armies dared to cross. King David was deposed, and a new ruler loyal to Cairo was installed. This wasn't just conquest, it was projection. Even distant kingdoms now knew that Egypt's shadow reached them. But some enemies were harder to pin down. The Nizari Ismailis, the assassins, had terrified rulers for generations with their dagger-wielding killers. Baybars besieged their castles one by one, forcing their surrender. Their fortresses became Mamluk outposts, their network dismantled. What fire and massacre couldn't erase, Baybars erased with obedience. Then, in 1277, he dared what no other ruler had attempted. He marched into Mongol territory. At Elbistan in Anatolia, his cavalry smashed a Mongol-led force, and he entered Kayseri in triumph. He withdrew before stretching his lines too thin, but the message was clear. Baybars was no longer defending against Mongols. He was carrying the fight to them. From Armenia to Nubia, from the assassins to the Mongols themselves, Baybars reshaped the map. Egypt was no longer a kingdom under siege. Under his hand, it became the power that reached across 3 continents. Baybars was not only a soldier, he knew swords alone could not hold an empire. To endure, power needed diplomacy, law, and symbols that people could see. He dealt with rulers as sharply as he dealt with enemies. With the Golden Horde, he forged alliances to counter Mongol Persia. With Christian kingdoms like Aragon and Castile, he struck trade agreements that brought wealth into Cairo. European merchants were allowed into certain ports, but always under his terms. Trade grew, yet never at the cost of control. To his subjects, Baybars became a living emblem. His lion blazon, carved on coins, fortresses, and gates, spread across the land. Wherever his armies marched, the lion remained behind as a mark of his authority. It inspired loyalty at home and dread abroad. At Lod, he built a new bridge on a vital route. 2 stone lions stood guard at its entrance, so that every traveler crossing into his realm saw power carved in rock before they saw soldiers. Even infrastructure carried his message. In Cairo, Baybars raised the Grand Al-Zahir Mosque, a vast and imposing structure built to outshine rivals and proclaim Cairo as the heart of Islam. Though it later fell into ruin, restoration has revived its towering walls. Its survival today still reflects his ambition, a monument meant to anchor his reign in the soul of the city. Baybars' greatest challenge was not the Crusaders, assassins, or the Mongols. It was the men who had made him sultan. The Mamluks were elite, ambitious, and dangerous. To rule them demanded a balance sharper than any sword. He rewarded his emirs with land revenues, but never allowed a single one to grow too powerful. Baybars kept them moving, constantly rotating commands and shifting governors from province to province, frontier to frontier. No commander stayed long enough to build a power base. Rival factions never had time to unite because he never let them settle. His empire stayed stable for one reason: only the Sultan was permanent. He also knew wars were not won by steel alone, but by the stories people told. His court chronicler, Ibn Abd al-Zahir, recorded every step of his reign, but always in a way that magnified Baybars' image. Like many rulers, he shaped how history would remember him. Yet unlike kings who left myths with little substance, Baybars' story was anchored in truth. The Mongols really were stopped, Crusader ports really did fall, and the courts, mosques, and postal roads he built truly endured. His image was polished, but the foundation beneath it was solid as stone. Even in the twilight of his reign, Baybars did not slow. He still rode with his armies, oversaw sieges, and personally inspected the frontiers. In 1277, after defeating a Mongol-led force at Elbistan, he marched triumphantly into Kayseri. For a moment, it seemed no frontier was beyond his grasp. But soon after, while in Damascus, his life took a sudden turn. During a grand reception, Baybars was served kumis, fermented mare's milk, a drink common among the steppe peoples he once called his own. Moments later, he fell violently ill. Some said the kumis was spoiled. Others whispered it had been poisoned. As Baybars lay dying, his court made a remarkable decision. They concealed it. Ministers and generals sealed the palace, issuing orders in his name, keeping guards and citizens unaware. The deception bought them days of precious time, enough to secure the succession. His son, Al-Said Barakah, was declared heir and prepared to take the throne. Only when the transition was complete did they finally announce the truth. Sultan Baybars, the Lion of Egypt and Syria, was dead. The world that had once feared his armies learned of his passing only after his empire was safe from chaos. Even in death, Baybars' presence was a weapon, wielded by his men to preserve order. Baybars left behind more than victories. He left an empire that could stand without him. His wars had bought the Muslim world decades of breathing room from both Crusaders and Mongols. His reforms gave the state tools to govern long after his death. By stripping the Crusaders of their ports and allies, Baybars forced them into a slow decline. When Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant, finally fell in 1291, it was the work of later Mamluks. But the path had been cleared years earlier, stone by stone, by Baybars' relentless campaigns. Without him, that final victory might never have been possible. His lion emblem still marks bridges, fortresses, and gates across Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. His postal routes carried intelligence for generations. His legal reforms shaped Cairo's courts for centuries. Baybars' story was retold in chronicles, poetry, and even folk epics, part history, part legend. For his enemies, he was a terror. For his people, he was al-Zahir, the manifest. His formal name was Sultan al-Malik al-Zahir, Rukn al-Din Baybars. He began as a captive boy on the steppes, sold into slavery. He ended as the Sultan who stopped the Mongols, broke the Crusaders, and bent empires to his will. 7 centuries later, his mark is still visible, carved in stone, written in law, remembered in legend. And his story remains one of the most improbable rises to power in all of history.